The air in the Kentucky hills holds its breath. In the autumn of 1881, nearly 2 decades after the guns of the Civil War fell silent, a lone trapper named Jedediah Stone pushed his way through a briar-choked hollow, a place the locals had long since learned to avoid. He was tracking a black bear, a prize that would see him through the coming winter, but the animal's trail had led him into a part of the Cumberland foothills that felt wrong. The birdsong had ceased. The familiar rustle of woodland creatures had vanished. There was only the sound of his own heavy breathing and the unnerving crunch of dead leaves under his boots. Then he saw it. Through a curtain of withered vines, a cabin stood like a rotted tooth against the graying sky. It was a ruin, yet not a ruin. The log walls were slumped and silvered with age, the roofline sagged like a broken spine, but the structure was stubbornly, unnaturally intact. A single window, dark and vacant, stared out at him like a dead man's eye. Jedediah was a man of logic and grit, not given to fanciful terrors, but an animal instinct screamed at him to turn back. He ignored it. Curiosity, that most dangerous of human traits, pulled him forward. The cabin door hung ajar, swinging silently on a single leather hinge. He pushed it open and the smell hit him first, not the expected scent of rot and decay, but the clean, sterile odor of lye layered over something else, something ancient and coppery. The interior was a sparse, single room coated in a thick shroud of dust and cobwebs. A crude table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth cold for a generation. It was a tomb perfectly preserved. But as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw the floor. In the center of the room, the rough-hewn floorboards were stained with a darkness so profound, so absolute it seemed to have drunk the very light from the air. It wasn't a surface stain. It was a saturation, a petrification of old violence that had turned the wood to something like iron. He knelt, his fingers hesitating just above the board, and felt it. A palpable, bone-deep cold radiated from the wood, a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn air. This was where the story of the 22 skulls would begin, not with a discovery, but with a feeling. A horrifying premonition that this forgotten place was not just abandoned, but had been purposefully and violently cleansed. To understand the horror that festered in that cabin, we must rewind the clock to 1863. Kentucky was not a state but a battleground of loyalties, a bleeding borderland caught in the brutal schism of the Civil War. It had not seceded, yet it was a slave state. Brothers fought brothers under the banners of both the Union and the Confederacy. Law was a luxury, a memory from a more civilized time. In its place, a more primal order reigned. Bushwhackers and guerrilla bands, men loyal to no flag but their own greed, roamed the dense forests and shadowed hollows, preying on the vulnerable. Travel was a death warrant. Supply lines were savaged, homesteads were raided, and people simply vanished. The war provided the perfect, chaotic backdrop for evils that had nothing to do with politics or patriotism. It was a time when darkness could thrive in plain sight, camouflaged by the greater, national darkness of the conflict. Deep within this treacherous landscape, nestled in a secluded valley miles from any real town, lay the Blackwood farm. It wasn't much of a farm. The soil was rocky, the yields meager. It was more of a fortress. The property was owned by Silas Blackwood, a man spoken of in whispers if he was spoken of at all. He had come to the area a decade earlier with his wife, Elara, and 2 young children, a boy and a girl. They were ghosts on the landscape, seen only on rare trips to the nearest trading post for salt and iron goods. They spoke little, their eyes scanning the faces of others with a flat, unnerving intensity. Silas was described as a gaunt figure, tall and unbent, with a face carved from hickory and eyes that held no light. Elara was a phantom, perpetually shrouded in shawls, her face pale and her movements furtive. Their children were silent, never heard to laugh or cry, their gazes as empty as their father's. The locals, a superstitious and wary people, gave them a wide berth. They said the Blackwood land was soured, that nothing good would grow there. They were more right than they could ever know. The family's isolation was absolute, their cabin a world unto itself. But it was what passed through the edges of their property that sealed its macabre legacy, a little-used wagon trail known only as the Lonesome Trace. And on the Lonesome Trace, people had begun to disappear. The Lonesome Trace was a scar on the land, a muddy, rutted path that snaked through the most desolate part of the county. It was a shortcut for the desperate or the foolish, peddlers trying to avoid military patrols, families fleeing the encroaching conflict, and soldiers on furtive journeys home. In the fall of 1863, the whispers began. At first, they were dismissed as casualties of war. A lone merchant from Louisville, known for carrying a small stash of gold coin, never made it to the next settlement. A Union corporal heading home on a week's leave vanished without a trace. His horse was found wandering miles away, saddle intact but its bridle stained with something that looked suspiciously like blood. The local marshal, a beleaguered man named Croft, had his hands full with deserters and raiders. He chalked the disappearances up to the notorious guerrilla captain, Marcellus the Butcher Flint, a man known for his ruthless cruelty. It was a convenient explanation, one that required no further investigation into the dark heart of the woods, but the pattern was wrong. Flint's gang was brutal, but they were not subtle. They left behind bodies, burned wagons, and terrified survivors to spread their fearsome reputation. These disappearances on the Lonesome Trace were different. They were silent. Absolute. It was as if the forest itself had simply opened its maw and swallowed these people whole, leaving behind nothing but a chilling void and a few scattered, meaningless objects. A dropped pipe here, a woman's tortoiseshell comb there. These were the forgotten breadcrumbs leading to a truth far more disturbing than any guerrilla raid. The locals, however, had their own theories, steeped in the grim folklore of the mountains. They spoke of a curse laid upon that stretch of land, of a preternatural beast that hunted in the twilight hours. Others whispered about the Blackwoods. They recalled how Sila's Blackwood never seemed to age, how his meager crops never seemed to fail despite the poor soil, and how he never lost livestock to wolves or sickness. It was unnatural. Rumors circulated that he had made a pact with something old and unholy that resided deep in the woods, a pact that required a periodic, blood-soaked payment. These were just stories, of course, the kind told around flickering fires to scare children. But as more travelers vanished, the stories grew darker, more detailed, and the invisible line separating folklore from a horrifying reality began to blur. The disappearances might have remained footnotes in the bloody ledger of the war, had it not been for the O'Connell family. Patrick O'Connell, his wife Maeve, and their 7-year-old daughter Fiona were refugees of a different sort. They weren't fleeing the war itself, but the famine and poverty that followed in its wake. They had sold their small plot of land in the east and were heading toward what they hoped was a new life in Missouri. They were warned against taking the Lonesome Trace, but their wagon was old, their ox was failing, and the shorter route was a temptation they couldn't resist. They were last seen at a trading post, where Maeve traded a hand-knitted shawl for a sack of flour and a tin of molasses. The post owner, a man named Eli, remembered the little girl Fiona, with her fiery red hair and a small, crudely carved wooden bird she clutched in her hand. He told Patrick the trace was bad luck, that folks called it the devil's spine. Patrick, a man of stubborn faith, simply nodded and said, "The Lord will see us through." The Lord, it seemed, was looking elsewhere. A week later, their broken-down wagon was discovered half sunk in the mud of a creek bed just a mile from the Blackwood property. The ox was still hitched, dead from starvation. The family's meager possessions were inside, untouched. A half-eaten loaf of bread sat on the wagon seat, green with mold. Everything was there except the O'Connells. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away from the wagon save for those of the man who found it. It was another silent, inexplicable vanishing. Marshal Croft dutifully rode out, made a few notes in his log, and declared it another likely victim of bushwhackers, who must have taken the family captive. But one detail lodged itself in the town's collective memory, a detail that defied easy explanation. Lying in the mud next to the wagon, almost buried, was the little girl's wooden bird. The simple child's toy was smeared with a dark, sticky substance, and carved crudely into its back was a strange, spiral-like symbol, a symbol no one in the county had ever seen before. The disappearance of an entire family, a family with a child, was different. It struck a deeper chord of fear. The lonesome trace was no longer just unlucky, it was beginning to feel forbidden. News of the O'Connell family's disappearance traveled slowly, a ripple of dread spreading through the scattered homesteads. For one man, however, it was more than just another tragic story. Deputy Thomas Kane was young, barely 25, and unlike his superior, Marshal Croft, he was not yet weary enough to accept convenient answers. Kane had grown up in these hills. He knew their secrets, their rhythms, and their dangers. He knew the difference between the chaotic violence of guerrilla warfare and the chilling, surgical precision of these vanishings. He couldn't shake the image of that abandoned wagon, a silent testament to a family torn from existence. He believed that something deeply wrong was festering out on the lonesome trace, a sickness that had nothing to do with the war. He began his own quiet investigation, poring over the sparse reports of the other missing persons. He noted the locations where they were last seen, the places where their belongings were found. A disturbing pattern emerged. All of the disappearances occurred within a 5-mile radius, a desolate stretch of forest and hills with one ominous feature at its very center, the Blackwood property. Kane decided to ride the trace himself, not as a lawman but as a traveler. He wanted to feel the road, to see what the victims saw in their final hours. The deeper he rode into that territory, the heavier the silence became. It was a living thing, pressing in on him from the dense, tangled woods. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers. He felt a persistent, prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the unshakable feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. He passed the spot where the O'Connell's wagon had been found. Though the wagon was gone, an indentation remained in the muddy earth, a grave-like hollow that seemed to resist the forest's attempt to reclaim it. He dismounted, and driven by an impulse he didn't understand, he began to search the surrounding woods. For an hour he found nothing. Then his boots snagged on something hidden beneath a carpet of damp leaves. He knelt and brushed them away. It was a small, silver locket, tarnished and caked with mud. He pried it open. Inside, faded but still visible, was a miniature portrait of a woman with Maeve O'Connell's kind face. This small, personal token was the first piece of a puzzle that would lead not to answers, but to a far more disturbing set of questions. We are dedicated to unearthing these forgotten cold cases. If you share that dedication, hit the notification bell so you won't miss the horrifying conclusion to this story. The silver locket was a tangible link to the vanished family, a cold piece of metal that felt heavy with unspoken tragedy. For Deputy Kane, it was proof. This was no random abduction. Robbers or bushwhackers would have taken something of value like a silver locket. Leaving it behind suggested a motive other than greed. He brought his finding to Marshal Croft, hoping it would finally spur a real investigation. The marshal, however, was unmoved. He glanced at the locket, his face a mask of tired resignation, and handed it back. A trinket, Kane, means nothing. The woman probably dropped it running from Flint's men. Let it be. We have a war to worry about, not ghost stories. Croft's dismissal felt like a deliberate act of blindness, and it only hardened Kane's resolve. If the law wouldn't seek justice for the O'Connells, he would. He began to discreetly ask questions around the county, not about the Blackwoods directly, but about the lonesome trace. He spoke to old trappers, farmers, and traveling preachers, anyone who knew the land. The stories they told were varied, but they all orbited the same dark sun. An old woman spoke of strange, flickering lights seen deep in the woods on moonless nights in the direction of the Blackwood cabin. A hunter recounted a time he'd been near their property line and heard a sound he couldn't identify, a low, rhythmic chanting, almost guttural, that made the hair on his arms stand up. He had fled and never returned. Another man, a farmer whose land bordered the Blackwoods, told the most unsettling tale. One evening, his dog had started barking frantically at the edge of his property. He went to investigate and saw one of the Blackwood children, the boy, standing perfectly still at the tree line, just staring at his cabin. The boy wasn't looking at anything in particular, just staring with a profound emptiness that chilled the farmer to his soul. When he called out, the boy didn't react. He simply turned and melted back into the shadows of the forest without a sound. These were fragments, whispers, folklore. None of it was evidence. But woven together, they created a tapestry of profound wrongness. The Blackwoods were not just recluses. They were a source of deep, primordial fear in the community. Cain knew that approaching them directly would be foolish. He needed more than superstition. He needed a witness. He needed someone who had seen something. He just didn't realize that the only witnesses to the horrors of the Lonesome Trace were already dead. Winter descended on the Kentucky hills, draping the landscape in a shroud of gray and white. The war raged on elsewhere, but in this isolated corner of the state, the conflict was a distant echo. The immediate threat was the cold, the snow, and the gnawing scarcity of food. The Lonesome Trace, now impassable with snow and ice, saw no travelers, and for a time the disappearances ceased. The lull brought a fragile sense of peace, but for Deputy Cain it was a torment. The cold case of the O'Connell family haunted his waking hours and stalked his dreams. He kept the silver locket in his pocket, its cold weight a constant reminder of his unanswered questions. During the long winter months, he turned his attention from the land to the archives, the dusty, neglected county records stored in the courthouse basement. He was looking for anything about Silas Blackwood. Who was he? Where did he come from? The search was frustrating. Records from that era were sparse and often incomplete. But after weeks of sifting through brittle, foxed paper, he found it, a land deed from 1853. It registered the sale of 75 acres of unclaimed land to a Silas Blackwood. The previous owner was not a person, but a church, a small, obscure sect called the Congregation of the Silent Way, which had disbanded years earlier under mysterious circumstances. Cain dug deeper, searching for any mention of this congregation. He found a single reference in an old circuit preacher's journal. The preacher described the sect as heretical and unnatural. He wrote of their belief that the land itself was a conscious entity, a sleeping God of immense power, and that true salvation could only be achieved not through prayer, but through blood communion with the soil. The preacher claimed the congregation practiced forbidden, macabre rituals to feed the earth and gain its favor, rituals that had led to their being banned and driven out of the neighboring state. The entry was dated 1852, just 1 year before Silas Blackwood bought their former land. It was a chilling coincidence. Had Blackwood been a member of this bizarre cult? Was his family continuing these blood communion rituals? The idea was insane, the stuff of Gothic horror novels, not real life. And yet, it fit the disturbing pattern in a way that bushwhackers and wartime chaos never could. The symbol carved into the little girl's wooden bird, the spiral, was a common pagan symbol for life, death, and rebirth. It was all starting to connect, forming a picture so horrifying, Cain could barely stand to look at it. The spring thaw of 1864 came late, turning the Lonesome Trace into a quagmire of mud and debris. With the reopening of the trail, the disappearances began again. This time, the victim was a man named Corporal John Sutton, a Union soldier returning from a Confederate prison camp. He was gaunt and weak, but alive, and making his way home to his wife and daughter. He was seen at the same trading post as the O'Connells, where he spoke of his ordeal and his eagerness to be reunited with his family. He bought a small bag of cornmeal and set off down the trace, promising to return the borrowed sack on his next trip. He was never seen again. When news reached Marshal Croft, it was the final straw, not because of the soldier, but because of who the soldier was. Sutton's father was a well-connected Union quartermaster with influence in Frankfort. Pressure came down from the state capital. Find the corporal or explain why a decorated Union soldier could survive the horrors of Andersonville prison only to vanish in a supposedly loyal county. Suddenly, the ghost stories of the Lonesome Trace were a matter of official concern. Croft, his job now on the line, had no choice but to act. He deputized a posse of 5 men, including a reluctant Thomas Cain. Their mission was simple: Ride the lonesome trace from one end to the other, search every hollow and creek bed, and find any sign of the missing soldier. Kane knew this was a fool's errand. They were looking for a body when the real problem was the living. As they prepared to ride out, Kane argued that they should pay a visit to the Blackwood farm. "It's at the center of it all, Marshal," he insisted. "Every disappearance has happened on their doorstep." Croft, ever the pragmatist, scoffed. "And what are we to say, Kane? Pardon me, Mr. Blackwood, but have you been sacrificing travelers to the soil lately? The man is a recluse, not a monster. We have no evidence, no warrant. We go near that farm, and he'll be within his rights to shoot us for trespassing." The marshal's logic was sound, but Kane's gut told him they were riding in the wrong direction. The posse set off into the woods, a line of armed men searching for clues in a landscape that had already proven it knew how to keep its secrets. They were hunting for a ghost, unaware that the real horror was watching them from the shadows, waiting for them to pass. The posse spent 2 days combing the dense forest along the lonesome trace. They found nothing. The woods were unnervingly clean, as if swept by an invisible broom. There were no tracks, no discarded equipment, not a single sign of Corporal Sutton. The men grew weary and frustrated, their initial bravado curdling into sullen fear. The oppressive silence of the area worked on their nerves, and they began starting at every shadow, every snapping twig. On the third morning, as they neared the edge of the Blackwood property, one of the men's horses shied violently, its eyes wide with terror. It refused to go further. In the ensuing commotion, another man noticed something half buried in the soft earth at the base of a massive oak tree. It was a Union Army satchel, its leather soaked through and rotting. Kane's heart hammered in his chest. He took the bag and opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were a handful of letters, their ink blurred but still legible. They were love letters, written to Corporal Sutton from his wife, Mary. They spoke of her prayers for his safety, of their daughter's first words, of her desperate longing for his return. The discovery of the satchel confirmed their worst fears. Sutton had met a foul end here, but it also provided something else. Tucked into a side pocket was the corporal's military-issue knife. The blade was clean, but the wooden handle was sticky with a dark, resinous substance. And carved into the handle, just as it had been on the O'Connell girl's toy bird, was the same crude spiral. The symbol was the link. It connected the two cases, proving they were not isolated incidents. It was the signature of a killer, or something far worse. Even Marshal Croft could no longer deny the evidence before him. The satchel was found less than half a mile from the Blackwood cabin. There were no more excuses, no more convenient explanations. The law was finally coming to the isolated fortress in the woods. Croft looked at his men, their faces grim in the dappled sunlight. "All right," he said, his voice low and heavy. "We pay Mr. Blackwood a visit." The decision hung in the air, thick with unspoken dread. They were no longer just a posse searching for a missing soldier. They were stepping into the heart of a mystery that had festered in the darkness for years, and none of them knew if they would be coming out again. The approach to the Blackwood cabin was an unnerving experience. The path was not a path at all, but a barely there trail that seemed to intentionally wind through the thickest, most tangled parts of the woods. The air grew colder, the light dimmer. It felt like a deliberate journey into a forgotten world, governed by its own set of grim rules. As they broke through the final line of trees, they saw the homestead. It was even more desolate up close. The cabin was small and windowless on 3 sides, presenting a solid wall of notched logs to the world. A thin plume of smoke curled from the stone chimney, the only sign of life. A few scrawny chickens pecked at the barren dirt yard. There was no garden, no fields of corn, only the cabin and a small, sturdy-looking barn. The place radiated an aura of profound and hostile solitude. Marshal Croft hailed the cabin, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. "Silas Blackwood. This is Marshal Croft. We need a word with you." For a long moment there was no response. The posse exchanged nervous glances, their hands inching toward their weapons. Then the cabin door creaked open. Silas Blackwood emerged, wiping his hands on a piece of burlap. He was just as the rumors described, tall, gaunt, with a face devoid of emotion. He held a large woodsman's axe in one hand, its blade gleaming dully. He didn't look surprised or afraid, merely annoyed, as if they were unwelcome distractions. "Marshal," he said, his voice a dry rasp like stones grinding together. "This is private property." Croft, trying to maintain a tone of authority, held up the corporal's satchel. "We found this on the edge of your land, Mr. Blackwood. Belonged to a Union soldier who's gone missing. We have reason to believe he met with foul play hereabouts. Have you seen anyone passing through?" Blackwood's eyes, the color of faded slate, flickered to the satchel and then back to Croft. He showed no recognition, no curiosity. "The trace is not my concern. The war is not my concern. We keep to ourselves." His gaze swept over the posse, lingering for a moment on Deputy Kane. It was a look of cold assessment, as if he were sizing up livestock. Kane felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air. There was no deception in the man's eyes, no hidden guilt. There was nothing. It was like looking into a well and seeing no reflection. This was not a man hiding a secret. This was a man for whom the concept of secrets, guilt, and law did not seem to apply. As Silas Blackwood stood there, a pillar of silent defiance, his wife Alara appeared in the doorway behind him. She was a wraith-like figure, thin and pale, her eyes wide and fearful in a face that seemed perpetually braced for a blow. She clutched a heavy shawl around herself, despite the mildness of the day, as if she were freezing from the inside out. Then, the two Blackwood children materialized on either side of her, emerging from the cabin's gloom like specters. They were perhaps 10 or 12 years old, a boy and a girl, both with the same lank, dark hair and pale skin as their parents. They stood unnaturally still, their hands clasped before them, and stared at the posse with the same flat, empty gaze as their father. They were like porcelain dolls, perfect and hollow. The sight of the complete family, assembled like a grim tableau, was deeply unsettling. Marshal Croft, flustered by their silent, unified stare, pressed on. "We need to search your property, Mr. Blackwood. Your barn, your land. We're looking for a body." Silas's grip tightened on the axe handle. A flicker of something, not anger but a kind of possessive warning, entered his dead eyes. "You have no warrant." "We have probable cause," Kane interjected, stepping forward. He held up the corporal's knife, showing Blackwood the spiral carved into the handle. "This symbol, we've seen it before, on the possession of another person who vanished on this road." "Can you explain it?" For the first time, a reaction. A subtle, almost imperceptible tensing of Silas's jaw. He glanced back at his wife, a silent, lightning-fast communication passing between them. Alara flinched, pulling her shawl tighter, and herded the children back into the darkness of the cabin. When Silas turned back, his expression was unchanged, but the atmosphere had shifted. The quiet hostility had sharpened into something deadly. "That is not my mark," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "You will leave my land now." He took a half-step forward, raising the axe slightly. It was not a threat of violence, but a promise of it. The posse members raised their rifles, the clicking of hammers loud in the tense silence. It was a standoff. Croft, seeing the situation escalating beyond his control, made a decision. He was a lawman, not a fool. He had no desire to die in this desolate yard over a handful of superstitions. "All right, Blackwood," he said, raising a hand to his men. "We'll go, but we'll be back with a warrant." Silas Blackwood simply watched them, his expression unreadable, as they mounted their horses and retreated back into the woods. As Kane looked back one last time, he saw the face of the young Blackwood girl, peeking from the dark sliver of the open doorway. Her expression was not one of fear, but of a chilling, adult-like curiosity. The retreat from the Blackwood farm was a tense and silent affair. The posse had been met with a wall of cold, unyielding defiance. They had no body, no confession, only a string of unsettling coincidences and a symbol on a knife. Marshal Croft was angry not at Blackwood but at the situation. "We have nothing," he grumbled as they rode. "We can't get a warrant based on a man being strange and a carving on a stick. The judge will laugh us out of his chambers." Kane, however, was more certain than ever. The reaction, or lack thereof, from the Blackwoods was more damning than any lie. It was the calm of a predator that knows it is untouchable. He was convinced the answers to the disappearances lay somewhere on that 75 acres of cursed land, likely in the one place they hadn't seen, the barn. A barn on a farm like this should be for livestock, for storing grain. But the Blackwoods had no visible livestock beyond a few chickens, and their land was unfit for any significant harvest. So what was in the barn? What did it store? The question obsessed him. He knew Croft would not authorize another visit without more concrete evidence. So Kane decided to go back alone. It was a reckless, perhaps suicidal, decision, but the images of the O'Connell family and the words in Corporal Sutton's letters tormented him. He felt a personal responsibility to uncover the truth, even if it cost him his life. He waited 2 nights, letting the full moon wane, biding his time. On the 3rd night, under the sliver of a dying moon and a sky thick with clouds, he rode out. He left his horse tethered miles away and made the final approach on foot, moving through the woods like a ghost. The forest was a different entity at night, alive with unseen movements and sounds. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the gaunt form of Sela's Blackwood. Every rustle of leaves sounded like the whisper of the strange, silent children. He reached the edge of the clearing and saw the homestead, a dark mass against the slightly less dark sky. No lights, no smoke from the chimney. The cabin was asleep, but his focus was on the barn. It stood about 50 yards from the main cabin, its large doors firmly shut and barred from the outside with a heavy wooden plank. Whatever was inside, the Blackwoods wanted it to stay there. This was the moment of truth. Kane drew his pistol, the cold steel a small comfort in the overwhelming darkness, and began to creep across the open, exposed yard, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Reaching the barn felt like crossing an ocean. Every crunch of the dirt under his boots sounded like a gunshot in the profound silence. He made it to the heavy wooden doors and paused, listening. There was no sound from within, no shifting of animals, no rustling of hay. Only the same dead, heavy silence that permeated the entire property. The outer bar was thick and heavy. He carefully, slowly lifted it from its brackets, the wood groaning in protest. With the bar removed, he pulled on one of the doors. It opened with a low, mournful squeal of rusted hinges. The air that flowed out was not the familiar, earthy smell of a barn. It was a bizarre, cloying odor, a mixture of damp earth, iron, and a faint, sweet smell of decay like rotting apples. It was the scent of a slaughterhouse, but older, colder. He peered into the blackness, his pistol raised. Moonlight offered no help here. He fumbled in his coat for the lantern he had brought, his hands shaking so much it took him 3 attempts to strike a match. The small flame flickered to life, casting a weak, dancing circle of light. He lifted the lantern, and what he saw made the breath catch in his throat. The barn was almost completely empty. The floor was bare earth, swept clean. There were no stalls, no haylofts, no farming implements. It was just a large, open space. But in the center of the floor was a square wooden hatch, about 4 feet by 4 feet, with a heavy iron ring set into it. It was a root cellar, or so it appeared. That would explain the smell of damp earth. But there was something else. Hanging from hooks on the far wall was an array of tools, all meticulously cleaned and arranged by size. There were saws of various lengths, heavy cleavers, long-bladed knives, hooks, and several tools he couldn't immediately identify, things that looked like they belonged in a surgeon's room or a tanner's workshop. They were not the tools of a farmer. They were the tools of a butcher. A cold dread far more intense than anything he had felt before washed over Kane. The truth was not in the barn. It was under it. He knelt by the hatch, the lantern light quivering, and reached for the iron ring. It was cold to the touch, and as he prepared to pull it open, he heard a sound from outside that froze his blood. It was the soft, deliberate crunch of a footstep in the dirt, very, very close by. Panic seized Deputy Kane. He was trapped. He extinguished the lantern, plunging the barn back into absolute darkness. His heart hammered against his ribs, so loud he was sure it could be heard across the yard. He pressed himself against the rough-hewn wall, pistol aimed at the doorway, his breath held tight in his chest. Who was out there? Sela's. Alara. He heard another footstep, then the unmistakable, soft sound of the barn door creaking as it was pushed open further. A silhouette appeared in the doorway, small and slender against the faint light of the night sky. It wasn't Sela's. It was one of the children, the girl. She stood there for a long moment, perfectly still, as if listening to the darkness itself. Kane didn't dare breathe. He could feel the sweat trickling down his spine. Why was she here? Had she heard him? Was she coming to check on something? The girl took a tentative step inside, her bare feet making no sound on the earthen floor. She didn't seem to be looking for an intruder. Her movements were familiar, practiced. She walked directly toward the center of the barn, toward the cellar hatch. She knelt beside it, her small hands feeling for the iron ring in the dark. It was a movement of routine, not discovery. Kane watched, utterly baffled and terrified. What could this child possibly want in a dark, foul-smelling cellar in the middle of the night? He realized with a jolt of horror that this was not a place of punishment or confinement. This was a place she visited willingly. After a moment, the girl seemed to change her mind. She stood up, turned, and walked silently back out of the barn, closing the door softly behind her. Kane remained frozen for what felt like an eternity, his mind reeling. The innocence he had subconsciously attributed to the children, seeing them as potential victims of their grim parents, was shattered. The girl's calm, nocturnal visit to this horrifying place suggested a complicity that was, in many ways, more disturbing than the specter of Silas himself. The forbidden nature of this family was not just a product of the parents. It had been passed down, a dark inheritance for the next generation. Once he was sure she was gone, Kane knew he couldn't stay. He had seen enough. The tools, the cellar, the girl's chilling behavior, it was more than enough to get the warrant. He had to get back to town, back to the safety of the law. He slipped out of the barn and fled back into the woods, not looking back. He didn't see the second silhouette watching him from the dark, unlit window of the cabin. He didn't see the pale face of the Blackwood boy, his eyes following the deputy's frantic retreat until he was swallowed by the night. Kane rode back to town like a man pursued by demons. The sun was rising by the time he stumbled into Marshal Croft's office, disheveled, mud-stained, and half-mad with what he had seen. He told Croft everything: the empty barn, the butcher's tools hanging on the wall, the strange cellar, and the horrifying, silent visit from the Blackwood girl. The story was so bizarre, so utterly outside the realm of normal human experience, that it would have been easy to dismiss as a product of fear and paranoia. But Kane's terror was genuine, infectious, and the details were too specific, too macabre to be invented. The detail of the girl finally convinced Croft. It was the unnatural participation of the child that tipped the scales from a simple murder investigation into something far more sinister. This time, there was no argument. Croft agreed they had enough to petition the circuit judge for a warrant to search the entire Blackwood property, including excavating the cellar. The judge, a stern, God-fearing man named Elias Vance, listened to Kane's testimony with a grim expression. He was a man who had seen the worst of human nature, especially during the war, but even he was shaken by the tale. He signed the warrant without hesitation. "Find the truth, Marshal," he ordered. "And if what this deputy says is true, may God have mercy on their souls." An hour later, a posse 10 men strong, armed to the teeth and led by Marshal Croft and Deputy Kane, rode out from the town. There was no chatter this time, no bravado. The men were grimly silent, their faces set. They all knew, deep in their bones, that they were not just riding to serve a warrant. They were riding to confront a darkness that had been festering in their midst, a sickness that had been preying on the lost and the forgotten. As they neared the turnoff for the Lonesome Trace, a farmer on a buckboard wagon flagged them down. He was wide-eyed with panic. "Marshal," he yelled, "it's the Blackwood place. There's a fire. The whole valley is filled with smoke." Kane and Croft exchanged a look of horrified understanding. They spurred their horses into a gallop, a terrible premonition taking root in their minds. They weren't riding toward a confrontation. They were riding toward an ending. But the horror wasn't over. It was about to be unearthed. The smell of smoke hit them long before they saw the flames. It was a thick, acrid smoke, heavy with the scent of pine and something else, something greasy and unpleasant that clung to the back of the throat. When they finally broke through the tree line into the clearing, the scene was one of utter devastation. The cabin and the barn were engulfed in a roaring inferno, flames leaping 50 feet into the air, consuming the dry timbers with a furious hunger. The heat was so intense it forced the posse to halt 100 yards away. The entire homestead was being erased from the landscape, scoured clean by fire. It was a funeral pyre, but for whom? Or what? There was no sign of the Blackwood family. No bodies in the yard, no tracks leading away. It was as if they had been consumed by the very fire they had likely set, or had simply vanished into the smoke-choked air. The fire was too large, too hot to fight. All the posse could do was watch, their faces illuminated by the flickering hellish light, as the structures that housed such dark secrets collapsed into a heap of glowing embers and black smoke. They waited for hours as the fire exhausted itself, the roaring flames slowly dying down to a smoldering, hissing ruin. It was a deliberate, calculated act. The Blackwoods had known they were coming. They had chosen to destroy their home, to incinerate any evidence it might have held, rather than face the law. It was a final, defiant act of sealing their macabre world away from prying eyes. For Marshall Croft, it was the end of the line. No family, no evidence, no crime scene, just a pile of ash. He officially declared the case closed. The Blackwoods, he would write in his report, were presumed to have perished in the fire. The missing travelers were officially listed as casualties of the war, their cases to be forgotten by history. But for Thomas Kane, it wasn't over. He stood staring at the smoking ruins, the warrant in his hand now just a useless piece of paper. He knew the Blackwoods were not in that fire. He could feel it. This wasn't an act of suicide, it was an escape. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that the greatest horror had not been burned away. It was still there, buried beneath the ash and charcoal, waiting in the cold earth of the cellar. Days turned into weeks. The official investigation was closed, the posse was disbanded, and the county tried its best to forget the unsettling tale of the Blackwood family and the lonesome trace. The war was drawing to a close, and people were eager to look forward, to rebuild, not to dwell on the dark pockets of madness that the conflict had shielded. The burned-out clearing in the woods was now a forbidden place, a black scar on the land that locals avoided with superstitious dread. But Thomas Kane could not forget. The image of the cellar hatch was seared into his mind. He was a man obsessed, haunted by the secrets that lay buried in that earth. He knew that if he didn't uncover the truth, no one ever would. One gray, overcast morning, he made a decision. Acting against all orders and common sense, he rode out to the ruins alone. He brought with him a shovel, a pickaxe, and 2 lanterns. He was no longer acting as a deputy. He was acting as a seeker of a truth so terrible, he was not even sure he wanted to find it. The clearing was even more desolate in the aftermath. A fine layer of ash coated everything, and the air still held the faint, sickly sweet smell of the fire. The foundations of the cabin and barn were visible, ghostly outlines of what had been. The ground was soft and black with soot. Kane walked directly to the spot where the barn had stood. He kicked away ash and charred debris until he found it. The cellar hatch was gone, consumed by the fire, but its square outline was still visible in the scorched earth. The ground here felt different, softer. He took his shovel and began to dig. The work was grueling. The top layer was a thick crust of charcoal and fused earth, but beneath that the soil was strangely loose, almost sandy. It was as if it had been turned over many times. He dug for hours, his muscles screaming in protest, the silence of the clearing broken only by the scrape of his shovel and his own ragged breathing. He dug down 3 feet, then 4. He was about to give up, to concede that the fire had destroyed everything, when his shovel struck something hard. It wasn't the sound of rock. It was a dull, hollow thud. His heart leaped into his throat. He dropped the shovel and began to clear the dirt away with his bare hands, his fingers scrabbling in the cool, dark earth. Slowly, an object began to emerge. It was white and unnervingly smooth. As he cleared away the last of the soil, the object's form became terrifyingly clear. It was a human skull. The skull was yellowed with age, its empty eye sockets staring up at the gray Kentucky sky. It was the skull of an adult male, Kane guessed, the jawbone set in a ghastly, silent scream. He felt a wave of nausea and triumph wash over him. This was it, the proof. The body Marshall Croft had needed. He had found one of the victims. He carefully lifted the skull from the earth and set it aside. His initial horror began to curdle into a grim determination. Where there was one, there could be more. He picked up the shovel and continued to dig, now with a feverish energy. A few inches deeper, his shovel struck another hard object, and then another. It was like digging in a cursed garden where the stones were human remains. He abandoned the shovel again, using his hands to unearth his horrifying discoveries. One by one, he pulled them from the cellar's earthen floor. A second skull, this one smaller, possibly belonging to a woman. A third, which had a visible fracture line across the temple, a clear sign of blunt force trauma. A fourth. A fifth. He worked like a man possessed, the pile of skulls growing beside the shallow pit. He lost all track of time, all sense of the outside world. His only reality was the pit, the dark earth, and the pale, grinning faces of the dead he was pulling from their unhallowed grave. They were not neatly buried. They were jumbled together, discarded like refuse, mixed in with loose soil and clumps of what looked like quicklime, which would explain the lack of other bones and the accelerated decomposition. This was not a burial site. It was a dumping ground. As the pile grew, he began to notice disturbing details. Some of the skulls had small, precise holes drilled into the forehead. Others had strange, spidery lines carved into the bone, symbols that looked nothing like the spiral but were clearly man-made. What kind of monster did this? What was the purpose of such macabre defilement? The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. Cain, covered in dirt and sweat, finally stopped. He counted the skulls he had arranged in a neat, horrifying row on the ground beside the pit. There were 22 of them. 22 silent, starring faces, a testament to the years of silent slaughter that had occurred on this forbidden piece of land. The full scope of the horror was finally, terrifyingly clear. The discovery of the 22 skulls sent a shockwave of terror through the county. This was no longer a story of a few missing travelers. It was the revelation of a mass murder, a secret charnel house that had operated for years under the very noses of the community. Thomas Cain was no longer a half-mad deputy chasing ghosts. He was the man who had uncovered the darkest secret in the state's history. Marshall Croft, faced with the undeniable, horrifying evidence, was forced to reopen the case. The skulls were brought back to town and laid out in the doctor's surgery, a grim exhibition that drew morbidly curious and terrified townsfolk alike. The doctor, a man named Abner Finch, examined each one. His findings only deepened the mystery and the horror. He confirmed Cain's observations. The victims ranged in age and gender, from young adults to the middle-aged. He identified the smaller skull as likely belonging to a female, perhaps Maeve O'Connell. Another, with its delicate features, could have been a child in their early teens, though Fiona O'Connell's was mercifully not among them. The causes of death were varied and brutal. Some showed signs of caving fractures from a heavy, blunt object. Others had nicks and cuts consistent with a blade. But the most disturbing findings were the post-mortem mutilations. The drilled holes were made with some kind of primitive hand drill, a tool a carpenter or a cooper might use. The strange symbols carved into the bone were precise, almost artistic, showing a steady and practiced hand. It was ritualistic. This was not killing for profit or out of rage. This was something else entirely. It was a process, a ceremony of desecration. The story of Silas Blackwood and his family transformed overnight. They were no longer just strange recluses. They were inhuman monsters, ghouls from a folk tale made real. The name Blackwood became a curse, a word used to frighten children into obedience. The lonesome trace was officially closed and the path was left to be swallowed by the forest. But the central questions remained unanswered. Who were all the victims? And where were the Blackwoods? Had they truly perished in the fire, or had they simply moved on, a plague of locusts ready to settle on a new, unsuspecting community? An official manhunt was launched, but it was a gesture of futility. The country was vast and still in turmoil from the war. A family of 4 could easily vanish, could shed their name like a snake sheds its skin, and re-emerge somewhere new. The Blackwoods and the full, horrifying truth of their motives had vanished as completely as their victims. In the absence of the killers, the investigation turned to their origins. Deputy Cain, now the de facto lead on the case, became obsessed with the strange cult he had uncovered in the county records, the Congregation of the Silent Way. He traveled to the state capital, spending weeks in the archives, searching for any further mention of the banned sect. The information was scarce, hidden away in forgotten church chronicles and the private journals of traveling magistrates. But he slowly pieced together a chilling history. The congregation was not just a heretical Christian sect. Its roots were far older, a strange syncretism of extremist Calvinist doctrine and pre-Christian European folk traditions that had survived in the isolated pockets of the Appalachian Mountains. They were, in essence, a death cult. They believed that God was not a benevolent creator, but a vast, indifferent, and hungry entity, synonymous with the earth itself. They believed that humanity's original sin was not disobedience, but the very act of being born, of drawing life and energy from the earth without giving anything back. Their blood communion was a literal belief. They thought that by returning the life force of others to the soil through ritualistic sacrifice, they could appease this hungry God, ensuring their own prosperity, health, and a form of twisted immortality. They weren't killing for malice. In their warped theology, they were acting as priests, maintaining a cosmic balance. The rituals described were horrifyingly specific. They involved the harvesting of the victim's final breath and the marking of their bones with symbols that represented the return of the soul to the earth. This explained the drilled holes, perhaps a way to release the spirit, and the strange carvings. It was a theology of murder, a doctrine of ritualized slaughter. Kane found the last known record of the congregation from 1852, when their community in eastern Tennessee was violently broken up by militia after local children began to disappear. Several members were hanged, but the leader, a man described as a charismatic and terrifying preacher named Malachi, escaped with a small handful of followers, including his own young family. The physical description of Malachi was vague, but it mentioned his unnaturally pale eyes and gaunt, towering frame. It was Silas Blackwood. He hadn't just been a member of the cult. He was its leader, its prophet. He had brought his forbidden religion to the isolated hollows of Kentucky and had continued his life's work, feeding his God with the lives of anyone foolish enough to travel the lonesome trace. The pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place, revealing a picture of methodical, faith-driven horror that defied all rational explanation. The revelation that Silas Blackwood was the leader of a murderous cult only deepened the public's terror, but it did little to solve the practical questions of the case. Where had he and his family gone? For years, the question hung in the air, a source of endless speculation and campfire stories. Some believed they had fled west, to the lawless territories where they could continue their practices unnoticed. Others claimed they had simply gone deeper into the mountains, finding another isolated valley to call home. There was even a persistent, whispered rumor that the family had never left at all, that the fire was a ruse and that they still lived in the deep woods, hidden in caves like wild animals, still watching and waiting. Thomas Kane, who was promoted to marshal after Croft's retirement, never stopped looking. For the rest of his career, he followed up on every rumor, every potential sighting. A family of silent recluses in Missouri, a strange preacher gathering followers in Arkansas, each lead turned into a dead end. The Blackwoods had achieved a terrifying, almost supernatural feat. They had walked away from a massacre of 22 people and simply ceased to exist. As the years passed, the story began to fade from headline news into local legend. It became a cautionary tale, a piece of macabre Kentucky folklore. The site of the burned-out cabin became a place of morbid pilgrimage for thrill-seekers, though most were scared away by the palpable sense of dread that still clung to the land. The skulls themselves were eventually buried in a mass, unmarked grave in the corner of the church cemetery, their identities, for the most part, lost to time. Only a few were ever tentatively identified, based on personal effects found during later, more thorough searches of the cellar's pit: a wedding ring, a distinctive belt buckle, a set of military dog tags. For the families of the victims, there was no closure, only the horrifying knowledge of how their loved ones had ended their days. The war had provided the perfect cover for all manner of sins. If you find these forgotten, dark histories compelling, consider subscribing to our channel, because the story of the Lonesome Trace is a disturbing reminder that sometimes the most horrifying monsters are the ones who believe they are saints. In 1881, 18 years after the Blackwood cabin burned to the ground, a discovery was made that added a final horrifying chapter to the legend. The trapper, Jedediah Stone, the man who first stumbled upon the abandoned, unburned cabin in a different hollow miles away, finally worked up the courage to report what he had found. At first, no one believed him. The Blackwood cabin was ash and dust, a known fact. But Jedediah was insistent, describing the cabin's unnatural state of preservation, the sterile smell of lye, and the deeply stained floorboard that radiated an impossible cold. The new marshal, a man younger and more skeptical than Kane had been, assembled a small party to investigate, more to humor the old trapper than out of any real belief. Thomas Kane, now gray and retired, his body stooped by the weight of the past, insisted on going with them. He had to see for himself. They followed Jedediah into the briar-choked hollow he had described, a place even more remote and inaccessible than the original cabin's location. And there it was, a cabin identical in almost every way to the one Kane remembered from that fateful confrontation. It was weathered and old, but it had not burned. It stood silent and waiting. Kane felt a jolt of ice in his veins. Could it be? Had the fire been a trick, a decoy? Had the family simply had a second, hidden residence? He pushed open the door and the same sterile, coppery smell hit him. The interior was the same, a table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth, and in the center of the room the same horrifyingly dark stain on the floorboards. The marshal and his men were baffled. "What is this?" one of them asked. "Another cabin? Did they have two?" Kane walked slowly around the room, his hand tracing the dusty surfaces. Everything was the same, yet different. The dimensions were slightly smaller. The construction was cruder, more rushed. It was a copy, a replica, but why? Why would a family of fugitives take the time to build a near-perfect duplicate of the home they had just destroyed? It made no sense. Then Kane's eyes fell on the stone hearth. Tucked into a crevice between the stones was a small, folded piece of brittle paper. He carefully pulled it out. It was a single page, torn from a journal or a ledger. The handwriting was cramped and spidery, and the ink was faded. It was not a confession or a letter. It was a list of names. The list contained 22 names, written in a precise, steady hand. Beside each name was a date spanning from 1854 to 1864. The first few names were unfamiliar, but then Kane saw it: Patrick O'Connell, followed by Maeve O'Connell. The next name on the list sent a fresh wave of horror through him: Fiona O'Connell. Her name was there. The 7-year-old girl. Her skull had not been in the pit. The doctor had been certain, but her name was on this list. The final entry was Corporal John Sutton. It was a ledger of their victims, a meticulous record of their harvest. The discovery of the list was a revelation, but the presence of Fiona's name created a horrifying new mystery. If her skull wasn't in the pit, what had happened to her? Where was she? The question hung in the air of the strange, duplicate cabin, adding another layer of macabre intrigue to the already nightmarish tale. The men began a thorough search of this second cabin. It quickly became apparent that this place had not been lived in for long. It was a temporary shelter, a way station. There were no personal belongings, no stores of food. But in the back corner, half hidden beneath a pile of rotting burlap sacks, they found a small wooden chest. It was not locked. The marshal opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried leaves, were several objects: a woman's tortoiseshell comb, a tarnished silver pocket watch, a small, well-read Bible with the name John Sutton inscribed on the inside cover. These were trophies, mementos taken from the dead, but there was one other item in the box at the very bottom. It was a crude, handmade doll, its body made of corn husks, its hair from strands of fiery red yarn. In its stitched hand, it clutched a miniature, crudely carved wooden bird. It was Fiona O'Connell. This second cabin was not just a shelter, it was a shrine. A place where the Blackwoods could keep the memory of their work alive. The existence of this place proved that they had survived the fire and had lingered in the area at least for a short time before finally disappearing for good. They had watched the investigation, watched the discovery of the skulls, and then when the coast was clear, they had moved on. The calculated coldness of it all was staggering. They were not just killers, they were collectors, curators of their own horror. The discovery of the second cabin and the victim's ledger deepened the Blackwood legend, transforming it from a simple, brutal story into a complex psychological horror. The question of the duplicate cabin became a central point of debate among those who studied the case. Why build it? Some theorized it was a purely practical measure, a pre-planned bolt hole for their inevitable escape. But others, including Thomas Kane, believed the motive was far more disturbing and rooted in their twisted theology. The cabin wasn't just a home, it was a temple, the physical space where their rituals were performed. In their minds, the location and structure itself may have held a sacred significance. By destroying the original, they were performing a cleansing ritual, but they needed to consecrate a new space to carry their faith with them. Building a replica might have been their way of ensuring the continuity of their power, of transporting their unholy ground to a new location. It was an act of psychological transference, allowing them to take their evil with them, intact and sanctified. The most troubling question, however, remained the fate of Fiona O'Connell. Her name on the list was a death sentence, yet her remains were not among the others. This discrepancy gave birth to the darkest theories of all. The congregation's doctrine spoke of feeding the earth, of returning life force to their hungry God. But some of the fragmented texts Kane had found hinted at another, even more forbidden practice, the idea of a vessel. In some rare instances, a life was not meant to be returned to the soil, but to be reshaped, emptied, and filled with the spirit of a more devoted follower. It was a form of ritualized adoption, a way of ensuring the congregation's bloodline would never die out. Could it be that the Blackwoods saw something in the little girl, a resilience, a spark they could mold? Did they kill her parents and then take her, not as a victim but as an acolyte? Was she raised as their own, her mind wiped clean of her past and reshaped in the image of their monstrous faith? The idea was almost too horrifying to contemplate. The thought of little Fiona O'Connell, not dead, but alive, growing up as the silent, starring sister to the other two Blackwood children, was a fate worse than a quick death. If this theory was true, it meant that when the Blackwoods vanished, they didn't flee as a family of 4. They fled as a family of 5, and they had taken the most innocent of their victims with them. The years continued to pass. The Civil War became a distant memory, and America lurched into the Gilded Age. The tale of the Blackwood family and the 22 skulls became a permanent fixture of Kentucky's dark folklore, a story told with a shudder, a reminder of the savage madness that the wilderness could hide. Thomas Kane lived to be an old man, forever haunted by the case that defined his life. He never stopped searching for an answer to the fate of Fiona O'Connell, but he never found one. The trail had gone cold decades earlier, frozen in the ashes of the first cabin and the dusty silence of the second. The mystery seemed destined to remain unsolved forever, a permanent scar on the region's history. Then in 1908, a letter arrived at the marshal's office in the small Kentucky town. It was addressed to the office of Marshal Thomas Kane. Kane had been dead for 3 years. The new marshal, a young man who knew the Blackwood story only as a local legend, opened it out of curiosity. The envelope was postmarked from a remote, dusty town in the Oklahoma Panhandle, a region known as no man's land for its lawlessness. The letter inside was written on a single sheet of yellowed paper in a shaky but distinctly feminine hand. It was short and cryptic. It read, "The soil here is thirsty. We have made it strong. The bird has learned to fly. The spiral turns forever. Do not look for us. We are the earth now." There was no signature. But at the bottom of the page, drawn in the same faded ink, was a small, unmistakable spiral. The letter was a ghost, a voice from a past that everyone had thought was buried. The bird has learned to fly. Could it be a reference to Fiona, the little girl with the wooden bird? We are the earth now. A clear echo of the congregation's unholy doctrine. It was a taunt, a final chilling message sent across the decades. The letter suggested that the Blackwoods or their descendants had survived. They had traveled west, found another isolated place, and had continued their work. The family and their horrifying faith had not died out. It had endured, it had spread. The letter was presented to the state authorities, but in 1908, a 45-year-old cold case from a backwater county, based on a cryptic anonymous letter, was not a priority. The letter was filed away and forgotten, a final, chilling postscript to the official record. The 1908 letter is where the official history of the Blackwood case ends, but the legend, of course, does not. The story, now imbued with a multi-generational, almost vampiric quality, continued to evolve. It became a cautionary tale not just about a single monstrous family, but about the persistence of dark beliefs, of how madness can be passed down like an heirloom. Researchers and amateur sleuths in the decades that followed have tried to trace the family's path. They've looked for patterns of unexplained disappearances in remote areas along the westward expansion routes, searching for echoes of the Lonesome Trace killings. Some have claimed to find them. A series of missing prospectors in Colorado in the 1880s. A number of vanishings near a small, isolated religious commune in Oregon in the 1890s. These are all circumstantial, tenuous links, impossible to prove. The Blackwoods, if they survived, were masters of hiding in plain sight, of blending into the vast, lonely landscapes of the American West. They had learned from their mistakes in Kentucky. They would never again stay in one place long enough to draw suspicion. They would become phantoms, a recurring nightmare in the nation's subconscious. The most chilling part of this theory is the question of the children. The two original Blackwood children and potentially Fiona O'Connell would have grown to adulthood. They would have had children of their own, raising them in their faith, teaching them the rituals, passing on the sacred duty of feeding the earth. How many generations have there been since Silas and Alara? How far has their bloodline and their doctrine of ritual murder spread? It's a horrifying thought. A family tree with roots watered by the blood of countless victims, its branches spreading unseen through the modern world. They would not look like monsters. They would be your quiet neighbors, the family at the edge of town that keeps to themselves. They would be the people who live in the places that others avoid, the houses at the end of lonely dirt roads. They would be the ones who watch and wait for the lost, the vulnerable, and the forgotten. The Lonesome Trace may have been reclaimed by the forest, but the evil that was born there may never have died. Let us return for a moment to the skulls themselves. They are the heart of this story, the silent, undeniable proof of the horror. 22 individuals, each with a life, a story, a family, were reduced to a grim tally in a madman's ledger and a desecrated piece of bone. Who were they? Beyond the O'Connells and Corporal Sutton, their identities are a mystery. They were the anonymous victims of the war, the people who fell through the cracks of history. They were peddlers, deserters, refugees, people whose absence might not be noticed for months, if ever. Silas Blackwood chose his victims with a predator's cunning, selecting those who were least likely to be missed. The sheer number, 22, is staggering for a single family of killers operating with primitive tools. It speaks to a level of efficiency and practice that is deeply disturbing. Over a 10-year period from 1854 to 1864, they averaged more than 2 victims per year. This was not a sporadic, opportunistic crime. It was a regular, sustained effort. It was their life's work. The physical act itself is almost incomprehensible. The luring or trapping of the victims, the act of murder, the subsequent grotesque ritual of preparing the skulls, and finally, the disposal of the remains. All of this was done in secret, with no one in the outside world having any idea of the abattoir operating in the Kentucky hills, and it was done as a family. This is perhaps the most macabre element of the entire case. This was not the work of a lone psychopath. It was a family enterprise. Silas may have been the leader, the prophet, but Alara and even the children were complicit. They participated in the horror. One can imagine Alara cleaning the tools, the children watching, learning, perhaps even helping in some small, unspeakable way. The cabin was not just a home. It was a factory of death, and every member of the family was a worker on its gruesome assembly line. It is this perversion of the family unit, the transformation of the home from a place of sanctuary to a place of slaughter, that makes the Blackwood case a uniquely disturbing chapter in the annals of American crime. The psychology of the Blackwood family is a dark and tangled thicket. Were they simply insane? Was Silas a charismatic madman who brainwashed his family into participating in his delusions? Or is the truth more complex and more chilling? To understand them, one must try to look at the world through their eyes. They were not, in their own minds, committing murder. They were practicing their religion. They were servants of a demanding God, performing a sacred duty. Their victims were not people, they were offerings, sacrifices required to maintain cosmic balance. This mindset, this complete and utter dehumanization of their victims, is what allowed them to kill so prolifically and without apparent remorse. They likely felt no guilt, no pity. They were simply doing their work. Silas, as the prophet Malachi, was likely a true believer, a man utterly convinced of his own divine purpose. His control over his family would have been absolute, a mixture of theological authority, patriarchal power, and fear. Ilara's role is more tragic and ambiguous. Was she a willing participant or a terrified victim herself, trapped in an inescapable nightmare? Her furtive, fearful demeanor, as described by those who saw her, suggests the latter. She may have gone along with the horror out of a desire to protect her children, or out of a simple, paralyzing fear of her husband. She is a ghost in the story, a silent partner to unspeakable crimes, and her true motivations are lost to history. But the children are the true horror. Raised from birth in this environment, they would have known no other reality. For them, the ritual slaughter of travelers would have been normal, as routine as chopping wood or fetching water. Their empty, emotionless stares were not a sign of trauma, but of an utter lack of normal human empathy. They were being molded into the next generation of the congregation, their souls shaped by a doctrine of death. The little girl's midnight visit to the barn was not the act of a curious child. It was the act of an apprentice, checking on the tools of her family's trade. The Blackwoods were not just a family of killers. They were a self-perpetuating system of evil. What of the land itself? The 75 acres of soured earth that the Blackwoods called home. The congregation of the Silent Way believed the land was a living entity. The local community, long before the Blackwoods arrived, considered it cursed. Did this place draw the Blackwoods to it? Or did their evil poison the ground on which they lived? It's a question that lies at the heart of many folk horror tales. The idea of a genius loci, or a spirit of a place, is an ancient one. Some places, the stories go, are inherently wrong. They are sites of old tragedies, ancient sicknesses, or geological anomalies that subtly affect the human mind. The Blackwood Hollow, with its oppressive silence and the feeling of being constantly watched, certainly fits this description. Perhaps the land was already a place of darkness, and Silas Blackwood, with his unique and terrible sensitivity to such things, was drawn to it like a moth to a flame. He may have believed he had found the perfect altar for his God, a place where the veil between the world of the living and the hungry earth was thin. Alternatively, the horror may have emanated entirely from the family. 10 years of bloodshed, of profound human suffering and terror, can leave a psychic stain on a location. The sheer emotional energy of such repeated violence might linger, impressing itself upon the very soil and trees. The cold spot on the floor Jedediah Stone felt in the second cabin might not have been a supernatural anomaly, but a psychic echo, a lingering residue of the countless horrors that had been committed upon it. The locals who burned the first cabin to the ground may have been acting on a primal, intuitive understanding of this. They were not just destroying a building. They were trying to cleanse the land, to cauterize a wound, to erase a stain that they feared might otherwise spread. Whether the land was the source of the evil or merely its vessel, the effect was the same. The Blackwood homestead became a place of palpable dread, a patch of earth so saturated with horror that it would be shunned and feared for generations to come. The story of the Blackwood cabin is a chilling example of how history can be swallowed by legend. As the years passed, the established facts of the case, The 22 skulls, the vanished family, the cult, became the skeleton upon which a body of folklore was built. The story grew with each telling, acquiring new, more supernatural details. Silas Blackwood became a 7-foot-tall demon with glowing red eyes. The children were said to be able to transform into wolves. It was claimed that on certain nights, you could still hear the screams of the victims echoing through the hollow. These embellishments are the natural consequence of a story so extreme it defies easy explanation. The human mind seeks patterns, seeks to categorize things. When faced with a horror as profound and motiveless as the Blackwood killings, it is sometimes easier to attribute it to supernatural forces than to confront the terrifying reality that human beings are capable of such methodical, ritualized evil. The legend serves a purpose. It acts as a container for the fear, a way of rendering the horror safe by placing it in the realm of make-believe. But in doing so, it also obscures the truth. It makes it easier to forget that the 22 victims were real people. It makes it easier to forget that the Blackwoods were not demons, but human beings who made a conscious choice to embrace a doctrine of death. The real horror of the Blackwood case is not in the supernatural embellishments, but in its cold, documented facts. The real monster is not a creature from a fairy tale, but a man who used faith as a justification for slaughter. The real curse is not on the land, but in the dark potential that lies dormant within the human heart. The story has become a part of the local identity, a dark tourism staple. But beneath the ghost stories and the campfire tales lies a cold case, a disturbing and largely unanswered mystery about the depths of human depravity and the terrifying power of belief. Comparing the Blackwood case to other, more famous instances of rural horror in American history, one finds that it is strangely unique. Cases like the Bender family of Kansas, who also murdered travelers at their isolated inn, were motivated by simple greed. H. Holmes, with his Murder Castle in Chicago, was a monster of urban modernity, a psychopathic con artist driven by sadism and financial gain. The Blackwood family's crimes stand apart because of their apparent motive: religion. They were not common criminals. They were in their own minds theologians. This makes them, in a way, even more terrifying. A killer motivated by greed or rage can, on some level, be understood. Their actions, though monstrous, operate within a recognizable, if twisted, framework of human desire. But the Blackwoods operated outside that framework entirely. Their violence was impersonal, ritualistic, and driven by a logic so alien it is almost impossible to comprehend. They represent a complete break from the shared values of human society. Their actions suggest that there are pockets of belief in the world so old and so dark that they are utterly incompatible with civilization. These are belief systems that see other humans not as fellow souls, but as resources, as fuel, as sacrifices. This case serves as a disturbing reminder that beneath the veneer of progress and modernity, older, more primal systems of thought can persist. They fester in isolation in the quiet, forgotten places of the world, passed down through generations, waiting. The chaos of the Civil War did not create the Blackwoods' evil, but it provided the perfect environment for it to flourish unchecked. It was a time when the rules of society were suspended, and in that vacuum, their ancient, bloody faith found room to grow and to feed. It is a chilling thought that there may be other such families, other such beliefs, hidden away even now, waiting for the next moment of chaos, the next breakdown of order to emerge from the shadows. The final, lingering question is whether the Blackwood legacy continues today. The 1908 letter from Oklahoma is the last, tenuous thread connecting the past to the present. If it was genuine, it means that at least one descendant of the Blackwood clan was alive and continuing the family's work at the turn of the 20th century. If the family continued to propagate, their bloodline could now be 5 or 6 generations deep. Their descendants would be living in the modern world. They would have social security numbers, driver's licenses, and internet access. They would be indistinguishable from anyone else, but they would carry with them a secret history, a dark inheritance taught to them in whispers, a sacred duty to feed the earth. Is it possible? Could a death cult from the 1850s survive in secret into the 21st century? It seems unlikely, but the history of humanity is filled with strange, persistent beliefs. And the United States, with its vast, lonely landscapes and its tradition of fierce individualism and religious freedom, provides fertile ground for all manner of strange ideologies to take root. The modern world, for all its connectivity, has its own versions of the lonesome trace. The homeless, the runaway teens, the undocumented migrants, these are the new forgotten travelers, people whose disappearance might not be noticed for months, if ever. It is a deeply unsettling thought, but the Blackwood family's methods are, in a grim way, timeless. Their evil was patient, quiet, and targeted the vulnerable. It is a formula that could still work today. We will likely never know for sure. There will probably never be a definitive answer to whether the congregation of the Silent Way still exists, but the possibility is a chilling one. It adds a final layer of unresolved dread to the story. The case isn't just a cold case from the past. It's a potential, ongoing horror, a story whose final chapter may not yet have been written. The site of the first Blackwood cabin is now just an anonymous patch of woods. The forest has reclaimed the clearing, and only those who know the story well could ever find the faint, moss-covered foundation stones that are all that remain. The second cabin, the replica, collapsed in on itself decades ago and is now just a pile of rotting logs, slowly turning back into the earth it was built upon. The lonesome trace itself no longer exists on any map. It is a ghost road, its path obscured by a century and a half of unchecked growth. The land is still shunned. Local hunters and hikers avoid the area, claiming the silence is too deep, the air too cold. They say it is a place that feels empty and watched at the same time. The 22 skulls remain in their unmarked grave, a silent congregation of the forgotten. Their stories died with them, their final moments witnessed only by the cold, pitiless eyes of their killers. The Blackwood family achieved what they set out to do. They served their God, they escaped justice, and they passed their legacy on. They became a myth, a dark fairy tale whispered in the Kentucky hills. But unlike most fairy tales, this one is real. Every part of it, the missing families, the silent children, the cellar full of skulls, is grounded in a horrifying, documented reality. It is a story about the fragility of law and order in the face of chaos. It is a story about the terrifying power of faith when it is twisted into a justification for atrocity. And it is a story about a family that turned its back on humanity and embraced something ancient, hungry, and utterly evil. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the greatest horrors are not supernatural, but are born of the human mind, and that the quietest, most forgotten places can sometimes hide the most unspeakable secrets. In the end, we are left with more questions than answers. What was the true nature of the symbols carved into the skulls? Was there a deeper meaning to the number 22? What happened to the bodies of the victims, as only their heads were ever recovered? And the most haunting question of all, what became of Fiona O'Connell? Did she die in that cabin, her remains disposed of in a way that left no trace? Or did she live, growing up to become a Blackwood, her fiery red hair a stark contrast to their pale, dark features? Did she have children of her own, teaching them the same hymns of slaughter that she was taught? The mystery of Fiona is the dark heart of the Blackwood legend. She represents the ultimate violation, not just the theft of life, but the theft of a soul. Her unknown fate ensures that the story can never have a truly final ending. It leaves a door open into darkness, a sliver of horrifying possibility that will never be closed. Thomas Kane went to his grave obsessed with that possibility. In his final years, he was known to ramble, telling anyone who would listen that he sometimes saw her in his dreams, a woman with Fiona's red hair and Sela's Blackwood's dead eyes, standing at the edge of a dark wood, holding the hand of a small, silent child. The case of the cabin that hid 22 skulls is more than just a disturbing cold case. It is a piece of American Gothic horror, a story that has seeped into the very soil of the place where it happened. It serves as a grim warning that the wilderness has secrets, that the past is never truly dead, and that some families' legacies are written not in ink, but in blood. The spiral turns forever. The silence that fell over the Lonesome Trace in 1864 was a profound one. It was the silence of secrets kept, of justice denied, of graves unmarked. The chaos of the Civil War provided the perfect shroud for the Blackwood family's atrocities, allowing them to operate for a decade with impunity. Their story is a chilling testament to how easily the veneer of civilization can be stripped away, revealing the primitive horrors that can fester in isolation. They were a cancer on the landscape, hidden by the fog of a nation at war with itself. The tale endures because it touches upon our most primal fears, the fear of the unknown, the fear of the wilderness, and the terrifying fear that those who look human may be something else entirely. The image of that isolated cabin, outwardly mundane but inwardly a temple of death, is a powerful and enduring symbol of this hidden evil. It reminds us that darkness does not always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it arrives quietly, on a lonely road, in the form of a strange, silent family that keeps to itself. The Blackwood case remains officially unsolved. The family was never caught. The majority of their victims were never identified. The full scope and meaning of their rituals are lost to speculation. All that is left is the grim, undeniable fact of the 22 skulls and the chilling, unresolved story that surrounds them. A story that serves as a permanent, dark stain on the history of Kentucky, a cold case that still radiates a palpable sense of dread, and a warning that even now, in the quiet, forgotten corners of the world, the earth might still be thirsty.